The Matrix. Over the years, I've had the chance to hear war stories from 5 Vietnam vets, ranging from a covert reconnaissance helicopter pilot who every night of his life sees in his dreams brains hanging out of gaping head wounds in the soldiers' heads he was flying out of the jungle, to a man whom, when he was 17 years old, enlisted with the hopes of a shorter term than had he waited to be drafted at 18, was the smallest guy in his platoon in large part by virtue of his youth, and therefore his lieutenant would shoot him up with heroin to sufficiently fuck up his nervous system so he could serve as a mole to flush out the Viet Cong in their tunnels, only for him to kill in hand-to-hand combat 27 men whose faces he sees in his dreams every night for the rest of his life. I can't even begin to understand what these men suffered, what these men are still suffering. It is beyond the capacity to be articulated in words, let alone any form of expression. The most indelible war story, though, to come out of the 20th century for me belongs to World War II. What happened to the Australian POWs captured by the Japanese and forced to build the railroads in Burma is beyond anything one could possibly imagine prior to hearing their story. Under living conditions, every bit as unconscionably harrowing as the death camps in Nazi Germany, these men were starved and tortured to the brink and beyond, and those who didn't die building the railroads had a fate waiting for them that would make Christ on the cross shudder. Try to imagine a young man starved and tortured, under 100 pounds, emaciated beyond imagining, laying in a hospital bed, with scarcely conceivable, relieved thoughts of convalescence percolating in his head. Finally, this living nightmare is over. Finally, I get to go home to my family. Finally, a new start right around the corner once I'm better. A new life, away from this horror of horrors, my life to be lived, spared by the mercy of God Almighty. A Japanese doctor wearing the trustworthy, white-robed, Spartan regalia of doctors comes in your room and leads you down a corridor. There's a procedure waiting for you. It's for your own good. What happens next? The doctor drills holes in your skull and prods at your brain just to see what happens. At this point, I pause. Then I pause again. Wait a little bit longer. There is nothing approaching a satisfactory value judgment to be made. There is evil with a capital E in this world. Sure, I'll grant you that. The Lord works in mysterious ways. Sure, I'll grant you that. No one can know the mind and will of God the Father. Sure, I'll grant you that as well. It was war, and horrible things that can't be explained by we mere mortals happened during wartime. Hold on just a second. Hold on a minute for good measure. Hold on, period. Any attempt to explain and understand events like this in history is a prevarication. This is so far beyond the pale of what language is capable of expressing and communicating to another sentient being as to render words meaningless. For there are no words. It does beg the question, where was God? If God can help people lose weight, find their sweetheart in this life, mitigate disputes at the workplace, surely he heard those young men's cries for deliverance long before the vivisections. Stories from World War II and Vietnam have a way of placing one's own perspective in a different light. As a kid growing up, I remember for years calling out to God the Father in prayer, "Ease my suffering, end my suffering. Does God the Father hear me?" Did God the Father hear the heart-rending, desperate supplications of those young men building the railroads in Burma long before their ushering into the operating room to have their skulls drilled into and their brains poked and prodded while they were still alive? Listen closely, and sometimes the sound of answered prayers is silence. I repeat, there is nothing approaching a satisfactory value judgment to be made. It is so far beyond the pale of words to even begin to derive meaning. But it happened. It happened right here on God's green earth, with the birds and the fish and trees and sunshine and warm summer breezes. It actually happened. I believe every word and tittle recorded in the Bible happened on this earth. It is a record of human beings communicating and having a direct experience with the universe, and thus describing that experience to the best of their ability with the vocabulary available to them in their day, and given the technology of their day and their understanding of that technology. To my mind, the Bible as a whole is every bit as strange and unfathomable and grotesque as anything happening in our present world, where humanity's relationship with artificial intelligence and technology has the world, has existence itself on the verge of a revolution that would have been unimaginable even 25 years ago. I take Jesus at his word. He said he was coming back in the first century. I believe him. This generation shall not pass. Be ready. I come quickly. The time is at hand. Every generation since Jesus came back to allow Thomas to feel the marks of the nails left in his palms has thought the end is near. The New Testament is sprinkled throughout with allusions and direct statements leading anyone alive during the first century to believe the second coming would arrive during their lifetimes. The sense of urgency is unequivocal. Prepare yourselves. It's coming. Time and time again, not just directly in Matthew chapter 24, verse 34, and Revelation chapter 1, verses 1 through 3, and Revelation chapter 22, verses 6 through 10. The end times urgency pervades the entire New Testament, and it's unmistakable. It's easy to cherry pick verses here, verses there, take them out of context, and make them say whatever you want them to say. What is damn near impossible to argue against is that since the completion of the book of Revelation by John of Patmos in the latter half of the first century, every generation has had its adherents that the end of the world is near. So before you run out of time and you're forced to kiss your ass goodbye, prepare yourself and be ready, for it's coming. Hell, it's here already. Look at some key events of the latter half of the first century AD. You have the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in 70 AD by the Roman army. It's not too hard to imagine the survivors of the Jewish-Roman wars of the first century interpreting end-time prophecy in that event. But what strikes me as uncanny to the nth degree is what happened in 79 AD and its proximity in time to the writing of the book of Revelation. When Mount Vesuvius erupted in 79 AD, per Wikipedia sources, the thermal energy generated was 100,000 times greater than that of the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the end of World War II. Pompeii is 150 miles from Rome as the crow flies. If there was ever a time in the history of the world since the completion of the book of Revelation when fire and brimstone rained down upon the earth and the end appeared to be near, it was at Pompeii in 79 AD. With the Jews and the Romans at each other's throats in the first century, what greater act of God could there be but the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD? I take Jesus at his word. I believe John of Patmos had a vision from heaven, and that this vision came to fruition on earth in 79 AD during his lifetime. The Matrix is real, and we are living in it. I no longer have a gender. I have a gesture. When you see me, I'm going to wiggle my ass, and I expect it to be reciprocated. For a modest, non-sexual ass wiggle is my gesture, which will supersede any gender identification because, well, just because. This world is crazy, and it always has been crazy. The Matrix was probably created long before the first century, but there was a confluence of events in the first century, not least of which the second coming of Christ, which altered the fabric of existence and thrust the world into a new epoch. Perhaps the lesson to be learned is we need to get on with the business of living and try to be kind to each other. If I found myself dozing in a country filled with those same birds and trees and fish swimming in the rivers and lakes close by, those same summer breezes tickling my toes and nose, don't forget the sunshine, and a horse came trotting by unattended and kicked me in the head, and I staggered forth, gathering my bearings as best as could be expected, and attempted to understand just what in the blazes is happening on this planet. I would. There are no words. December 2019.